Imagine waking up one morning to find that your husband has vanished. No goodbye, no note, just an eerie emptiness. This is the story of Yasodhara, the woman left behind by one of the most famous spiritual awakenings in history. This is not just a story of pain, but a heroic epic of resilience. This is the story they don't tell you. The story of the Buddha's wife, who transformed the heartbreak of abandonment into a path to liberation and forever changed the face of spirituality. Destiny and vows across lifetimes. The story of Yasodhara and Siddhartha began long before they were born into a life of silk and power. According to ancient Jataka tales, these two souls were connected across countless lifetimes. Their meeting was no coincidence, it was orchestrated by destiny. In one past life, Yasodhara was a devoted wife who prayed for her husband's spiritual success. In another, they sought the path to enlightenment together. Yasodhara was no delicate princess. Born into the noble Shakya clan, she was brilliant and sharp, a woman who could hold her own in political discussions and philosophical debates. She was not a prize to be won, but a woman of her own mind, who chose her life partner. Their wedding was a magnificent affair. Palace life seemed perfect. Gold shimmered everywhere, servants attended to every need, and they had 3 palaces for different seasons. Then, their baby boy, Rahula, was born. For a moment, it was a living fairy tale. But Yasodhara, with her keen perceptiveness, noticed the first cracks. She saw Siddhartha's late-night walks, his eyes staring into the starry sky for hours. She sensed the growing restlessness in his gaze and the questions about suffering that came out of nowhere. A storm was building, and she was intelligent enough to sense it. But no one, not even Yasodhara, could have predicted just how big that storm would be. The night of the storm. That night, Yasodhara was sleeping peacefully next to her husband and son. According to the Mahavastu, one of the earliest Buddhist texts, Siddhartha looked at his sleeping family one last time. Some versions say he almost woke her, but in the end, he chose silence. He abandoned everything, power, fame, family, and disappeared into the darkness. Morning came, and Yasodhara reached across the bed to find it empty. She called for him, only silence answered. She ran through the palace, asking servants and guards, but no one had answers. Then the terrible truth hit her. Her husband, the father of her child, the future king, had vanished without a word. Feel that moment, the confusion, the panic, the shame. But this is where Yasodhara's strength began to shine. Instead of collapsing, she got angry, not because he went to war or for another woman. She was furious that he had abandoned his son, his people, and everything they had built together, without an explanation or a purpose anyone could understand. While the palace buzzed with whispers and neighboring kingdoms wove tales of a captured or mad prince, Yasodhara held her head high. She raised Rahula alone, facing the judgment of an ancient society that blamed wives when husbands disappeared. She not only survived but rebuilt her entire world from the ground up. The return of a stranger. Years passed, with no letters, no messages, no confirmation he was even alive. The woman who once had everything now had to learn to live again. Then, rumors began to trickle in. Merchants brought strange tales of a wandering teacher somewhere near Bodh Gaya. A man who spoke about suffering and liberation. Someone who looked familiar. At first, Yasodhara dismissed the rumors. Dozens of spiritual teachers roamed India. Why would this one be different? But something inside her had changed during those years of abandonment. The palace's luxuries, the gold, the servants, all felt hollow now. She began visiting temples, not out of royal duty, but to search for something real. Something that could explain why her perfect life had crumbled. One day, a traveling monk arrived at the palace gates. He spoke of a teacher called the Buddha, the awakened one, who had discovered the root of all suffering. The monk described the teacher's background, a prince from the Shakya clan named Siddhartha Gautama, who had left his family to seek the truth. When the monk mentioned the name, a chill ran down Yasodhara's spine. The room began to spin. Her missing husband, the man who had left her without explanation, had become the most famous spiritual teacher in India. Relief flooded through her first. He is alive. Then came anger. Then confusion. But then, an emotion she hadn't expected, curiosity. From abandoned wife to pioneering awakened one. The Vinaya Pitaka tells us that 6 years after his enlightenment, the Buddha returned to his homeland. Yasodhara heard the news before anyone else. The entire kingdom was abuzz with excitement. But Yasodhara made a shocking decision. While every other royal family member rushed to greet the enlightened prince at the city gates, she stayed in the palace. She wasn't going to run to him as if nothing had happened. If he wanted to see her, he would have to come to her. And he did. His footsteps approached her chamber. The man who entered looked like Siddhartha, yet was completely different. He was calmer, more present. His eyes held a depth that hadn't been there before. He wore simple robes instead of royal silk. The ancient texts don't record the details of their reunion, but we can imagine the weight of that moment. Two people who had become completely different. He had found enlightenment by abandoning everything. She had found strength by staying and rebuilding. Both had been transformed, but through opposite paths. After their private conversation, Yasodhara made a stunning announcement. She wanted to join the Sangha, the community of Buddhist practitioners. Not to follow her husband, but to follow her own path to enlightenment. This is where Yasodhara's story becomes revolutionary and where most history books conveniently skip the details. At first, the Buddha refused her request. Not because he doubted her spiritual capacity, but because the Sangha was for men only. But Yasodhara wasn't the type to accept no quietly. She teamed up with Mahapajapati Gautami, the Buddha's stepmother, and a group of other royal women. Together, they approached the Buddha again and again. When he still said no, they did something unprecedented. They shaved their heads, put on yellow robes, and showed up at the monastery anyway. Imagine the scene. A group of women, former princesses and queens, standing at the gates of an all-male religious community, demanding equal access to spiritual training. This was not 2024. This was 500 BCE. Women challenging religious authority was unheard of. Finally, after pressure from his cousin Ananda, the Buddha relented. He established the Bhikkhuni Sangha, the order of Buddhist nuns, and Yasodhara became one of the first women ever ordained in the Buddhist tradition. But she didn't stop there. The Therigatha, a collection of verses by early Buddhist nuns, includes Yasodhara's own words. I have cut off my hair. I have put on the yellow robe. I live by alms, having been a woman of great beauty. Now I am free from attachment. She wasn't celebrating becoming a nun to be near her former husband. She was celebrating her freedom from everything that had once defined her: beauty, marriage, status, and royal privilege. Yasodhara developed her own teaching style, her own insights, and her own followers. She became known for helping other women understand that spiritual awakening didn't require suffering and silence. She taught that pain, abandonment, betrayal, these were not obstacles to enlightenment. They were gateways to understanding the temporary nature of all relationships, all circumstances, and all identities, the hidden truth. So why don't we know more about Yasodhara's story? Why isn't she mentioned in every Buddhism class alongside the Buddha himself? The reality is brutal. Early Buddhist texts were preserved through oral tradition, passed down by monks, recorded by male scholars, and interpreted through centuries of male-dominated religious institutions. Male scholars simplified women's stories, minimized them, and sometimes erased them entirely. The official narrative became, the Buddha left his wife and child to seek enlightenment. End of story. Her pain became a footnote. Her spiritual achievements became secondary details. This pattern repeats throughout religious history. How many female disciples vanished from Christianity? How many women mystics disappeared from Islamic texts? How many Hindu female sages were forgotten? Recent scholarship has started recovering these lost voices. Feminist Buddhist scholars and historians are digging deeper into the Therigatha, analyzing archaeological evidence, and questioning traditional interpretations. They are discovering that early Buddhism had far more female leadership than we've been taught. Women didn't just follow men into spiritual life, they created their own paths. They achieved their own enlightenment. Yasodhara wasn't unique because she was the Buddha's wife. She was unique because she transformed personal suffering into universal wisdom. She broke gender barriers that had stood for millennia. She proved that enlightenment doesn't require abandoning responsibility but transforming how you carry it. Her story raises a haunting question. How many other Yasodharas existed throughout history? How many women turned their pain into power, their abandonment into awakening, and their silence into strength, only to have their stories buried because they didn't fit the narrative men wanted to tell? Buddhism teaches that all beings have Buddha nature, that everyone can achieve enlightenment, and that gender, status, or background do not matter on the spiritual path. Yasodhara proved this teaching true. She didn't need anyone's permission to become enlightened. She didn't need her husband's guidance to find the truth. She needed exactly what she had: intelligence, determination, and the courage to transform suffering into wisdom. A whisper across time. Yasodhara's journey teaches us something profound about resilience, transformation, and refusing to let other people's choices define your worth. She didn't wait to be rescued. She didn't spend decades bitter about abandonment. She didn't define herself through someone else's spiritual journey. Instead, she took the worst moment of her life and used it as raw material for enlightenment. Think about that. The pain of being left behind became her gateway to understanding impermanence. The shame of public abandonment became her teacher about the illusion of social status. The challenge of single motherhood became her training in compassion and strength. Modern psychology calls this post-traumatic growth. Buddhism calls it the transformation of suffering into wisdom. Her story matters because it shows us a different model of spiritual awakening. Not the dramatic renunciation of everything, but the patient transformation of everything. Not an escape from responsibility, but the enlightened embrace of it. She became a teacher, a leader, a pioneer, and a mother. She proved that spiritual development doesn't require choosing between personal growth and caring for others. The woman history tried to forget. The voice patriarchy tried to silence. The story traditional Buddhism tried to minimize turns out to be one of the most powerful examples of enlightenment we have. Today, as we struggle with our own disappointments, our own betrayals, our own moments of being left behind, Yasodhara's life whispers across 2.500 years. Your abandonment is not your ending. Your suffering is not your identity. Your pain is not your prison. These are your teachers if you are brave enough to learn from them. Maybe the real question isn't what Buddhism would look like if we heard more women's voices. Maybe the real question is what your life would look like if you stopped waiting for someone else to give you permission to transform. 25 centuries later, when life abandons you in the darkness, remember that somewhere in ancient India, a woman woke up alone and chose to become extraordinary.